It's that time again. Time to enter the strange world of the paranormal. And tonight's story concerns a haunting which occurred in a perfectly ordinary garage, or more precisely, to one of the employees at the garage. But as usual, let me set the scene. The garage itself consists of a set of petrol pumps, a car wash, and a workshop where routine repairs and servicing is carried out. The owner of the garage is a man in his early 40s. In addition to the services which I've just mentioned, as the garage is close to a major motorway, it has an arrangement with the police and rescue organizations to take any cars which might have broken down or crashed and have to be removed to a safe place. So there's a steady stream of cars coming into the large storage area behind the main buildings. The pickup truck is always very busy, especially during the holiday seasons. The mechanics work on a rota system so that there's a 24-hour call-out facility. Business is very good, and at the time that my story starts, it was particularly rushed. There'd been a spate of crashes on the motorway, so the compound looked like a breaker's yard. Anyway, one particular night, a mechanic was called out to a crash, and when he got there, he found that it had been fatal. The lady driving the car had been killed instantly when she'd veered into the central reservation for no apparent reason, and the car itself was a complete write-off. He had a chat with the police who were at the scene of the crash, and then hoisted the mangled wreck onto the back of the truck and drove back to the garage. When he got there, he dumped the twisted metal into the compound and parked his truck. He then went into the office to get a cup of tea before going home to await the next call from the police. As he waited for the kettle to boil, he mused on what could have caused the car to crash as it had done. The only thing he could think of was that either the steering had failed or perhaps a tire had burst and caused the driver to lose control. Anyway, as soon as he'd made his cup of tea, he forgot about the wreck and concentrated on reading the paper and doing the crossword. After about 10 minutes, for no apparent reason, he suddenly felt as if someone was watching him. He noticed that he'd begun to feel cold. In fact, the temperature of the room was definitely falling fast. He looked round, but he could see nobody. So he returned to his crossword. But not for long. Once again, he was aware of a feeling of being watched. He looked around again, but still couldn't see anyone. But this time, just as he was about to do his crossword again, he noticed in the corner of his vision what looked like a figure standing just behind him. He turned sharply, and this time, he definitely saw something. At first, it was like a grey shadow, almost a sort of mist, which seemed to swirl and writhe in an unfelt breeze. Mystified and a little bit nervous, he got up and approached the mist. But as he got near to it, he was brought to a sudden halt. It was as if he'd walked into an invisible barrier. He stopped and tried to rationalize this weird sensation. And then he noticed that the mist had gone. So he turned to go back to his chair. But as he did so, he once again saw the shape. Only this time, it was standing next to his seat. It was at this point that nerves were replaced by a sort of anger. He didn't understand what was going on, but he wasn't going to be messed about like this. In a voice which trembled slightly, he demanded to know who was playing silly games. There was no reply, of course, and he strode towards the seat. Or at least, he tried to. But he found that once again, he was stopped by an invisible barrier. Anger was now replaced by panic, because no matter which way he turned, he couldn't move. He was trapped in an unseen cage, which restricted his movements almost completely. Petrified, he wondered what was happening and what he could do. And as these thoughts ran through his head, he saw that the misty shadow was taking on a more definite shape. Awestruck, he watched as the shape of a person formed before his eyes. The mist went from being a vague mass to a human shape, and then to the clear figure of a woman. She was about 25 to 30 with long, dark hair. She was dressed in a bright yellow blouse or shirt and had dark slacks on. All this information the mechanic took in a matter of seconds. But what he couldn't take in was the fact that the woman's face was unrecognizable as human. It was just a mass of pulp. Blood coursed down from what must have been her forehead, and her left leg was twisted at an impossible angle. The man stood transfixed. His brain couldn't grasp what he was seeing. He felt fascinated and sick at the same time. His head began to swim, and just as he thought he was about to faint, he heard a voice. It was coming from the apparition in front of him. And then the ghost raised its right arm and pointed at him. As it did so, he felt a stabbing pain in his chest, as if an ice-cold spear had been plunged into him. He staggered backwards, but not very far, as he was still enclosed by this invisible cage. And then the words began to become clear. He heard the apparition say that it was his fault that she was there in this state, that if it hadn't been for him, she would still be alive. Naturally, the man asked in a weak voice what she meant, but all he got in reply was the same message, with the addition that he must look at the car very closely. Or he still didn't understand, and was about to demand another explanation when the figure in front of him disappeared. At the same time, the invisible cage around him also vanished, and he was able to move again. The man felt totally drained, and certainly unable to do any more work that night. So after a while in which he tried to gather his senses and to figure out what he'd just experienced, he rang a colleague and asked him to take over his shift as he was feeling ill. He used the excuse that he was feeling sick after attending a bad crash, which was partly true. Then he went home. But he didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mutilated figure of the woman and heard the words that he must look at the car. The next day he went into work, and the first thing that his colleagues noticed was that he was looking pale and drawn. The boss suggested that he might be better taking the day off, as he was obviously unwell. But the man insisted that he was all right. At the first available opportunity, and despite himself, he went into the compound and took a close look at the crashed car he'd brought in the previous night. At first, he saw nothing unusual. And then it suddenly struck him. He did recognize the car after all. It had been in the garage only last week for a service, and he had done the work on it. But something else. He'd done some work on the steering rack as it was a bit worn, but he hadn't done a complete job. In other words, he'd botched it because he'd been anxious to leave work on time, and he knew that if he was to complete all that was necessary, he'd have to stay late. And in any case, the boss had faithfully promised the owner that the car would be ready by 5 o'clock. So he'd just tightened a few nuts and left it at that. Naturally, he didn't tell anybody, and the lady owner had paid for work which hadn't been done. The mechanic looked under the wreck at the steering rack and immediately found the cause of the crash. It had sheared in a critical place, something which wouldn't have happened if he'd done his job properly. Full of remorse, but unable to admit his fatal error, the man went home as the boss had suggested and tried to get some rest and sleep. But they both eluded him. Instead, just as dark was falling, he saw the ghost of the lady driver again. This time it didn't say anything to him, it just pointed at him in an accusing way. And this went on for night after night, until after 10 days or so, the man was a shadow of his former self. So he finally went to the police and admitted what he had done. Rather, what he hadn't done. No action was taken against him, but he felt that he could no longer work as a mechanic. So he packed in his job, and after a period of convalescence, he applied to be trained as a Samaritan. This was the only way he felt that he could atone for the fatal mistake which had caused an innocent human to be deprived of life at such a young age. Sometime later, he became a social worker, his particular skill being in counseling those people who had been recently bereaved. Since he became a fully qualified Samaritan, the man's not seen the ghost again. But his whole attitude to life has changed, and he's become one of the most selfless people you could ever wish to meet. Which all goes to prove that not all paranormal events have a sad ending.